going to the next concept, that is cardiac output and the concept of pulse and blood pressure, what we are going to do is we are going to do a little estimate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a straight line. Okay. Now on this straight line, I'm going to put 8 lines, each representing 1 second, 0.1 second, right? So 1, 2, like that I'm going to put it. So each line will represent 1 second, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. Right. Now, if we put the various events of cardiac cycle based on their timing, we can say that let us put all the arterial events on the top side and all the ventricular events on the bottom side. So the articular events, when I say, it will begin with arterial systole, which lasts for only 1.1 second. So this is arterial systole, right? Following that, arteria is relaxed. So arterial diastole, arterial diastole, 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 and diastole. So this means the atrium is in contraction only for 0.1 seconds. Atrium are in contraction mode or in systolic mode for only 0.1 seconds, the rest all 0.7 seconds. Atrial diastole, the atrial diastole individually lasts for 0.7 seconds. Correct? Now, if I say put the ventricular ones at the bottom, now we know that when atrial systole is happening, the ventricle is actually under relaxation. Right. So when this is happening, you have the ventricular diastole, VD. Okay, followed by ventricular systole, ventricular systole, ventricular systole, because ventricular systole lasts for 0.3 seconds. Then you have again ventricular diastole, ventricular diastole, ventricular diastole, and ventricular diastole. Correct? So you have for ventricles, ventricle contraction, ventricular systole is for 0.3 seconds, and ventricular diastole lasts for 4 plus 1, 0.1 plus 0.4, that is 0.5 seconds. Right. Now, when the arterial systole happens, when the arterial systole is happening, there will be an increase in the volume of blood in the ventricle. Okay, because blood is flowing from arterial to ventricle, right? Blood flow. Now, this the blood flow or the blood volume in the ventricle is known as EDV, that is end diastolic volume. End diastolic volume. It is the volume of blood that is present in the ventricle before it starts contraction. The next step is ventricular contraction, right? From here it will go to ventricular contraction. So at the before it goes into contraction, before it is moving into the systolic phase, the amount of blood present in the ending phase of the diastole of the ventricle is end diastolic volume, which is somewhere around 130 ml. Right. Now, after some time, what happens? You have the ventricular movements, and finally you have the ventricular ejection. You have the ventricular ejection. Okay. Now, that means what? Some amount of blood is pushed into the pulmonary trunk and into the systemic trunk. So ventricles have pushed away the blood. But after pushing away, when the ventricles start to relax, that is when they reach the ventricle diastole again from the contraction, during this time you have ESV. What is ESV? End systolic volume. That means the amount of blood that is present in the ventricles before the diastole begins or at the end of the systole, that is called as end systolic volume, which is 60 ml to 70 ml. Okay, there is a so now you understand what is end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. End diastolic volume is the amount of blood present in the ventricles after the blood came from the atrium, the leftover blood in the ventricles together combiningly. So before the ventricles start to contract whatever blood after receiving the blood from the atrium, the combined volume of the ventricular blood is called as end diastolic volume. And after the ventricular contraction happened, when it pushed whatever blood it can push out of the ventricles, the leftover blood in the ventricle before it starts to undergo diastole is called as end systolic volume. Okay, so there is a reason for me to write this number. Why? Because here we are going to talk about cardiac output. Here we are going to talk about cardiac output. Right. Now, mathematically, cardiac output is calculated as, which is given as CO is equal to SV into HR, where SV is stroke volume. Right. So anyway, we'll go to that stroke volume in a little second. First, let us understand what is this cardiac output. So cardiac output is, is defined as the amount of blood ejected by the ventricles, amount of blood that comes out by the ventricular ejection of ventricles per minute. So in a minute, how much of blood will the ventricles be ejecting, whether it is right ventricle or left ventricle, that is said to be our cardiac output. Normally, for every cardiac cycle, on a rough approximate way, if we say every cardiac cycle which lasts for 0.8 seconds, see, one cardiac cycle lasts for 0.8 seconds. Like that, you should have 72 times the heart should beat. Each beat is nothing but one cardiac cycle. So there should be 72 times of cardiac cycle, and in that 72 times, how much ml of blood is coming out. That is what we are going to understand here. Now, for that, we need to calculate the stroke volume. Okay. Now, what is stroke volume? Stroke volume is SV. Stroke volume is nothing but SV. It is said to be the amount of blood ejected from the ventricle. Okay, so it is the amount of blood ejected from the ventricle per cardiac cycle. Per one cardiac cycle, how much it is doing. So a stroke volume is calculated by end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. Okay, it is obvious, na? End diastolic volume is the maximum amount of blood in the ventricle. End systolic volume comes after the ejection. So when you take the total amount and subtract the leftover amount, you will get the amount that has been pushed. So it is 130 minus 60 or 70, which will come around to again 70 ml or 60 ml. So each cardiac cycle, the ventricles, whether it's left ventricle or right ventricle, they push out blood of 60 to 70 ml into the pulmonary trunks and into the aorta. So when you take this and do the cardiac output, so when you calculate cardiac output, it will be 60 or 70 ml into number of heartbeats. What is the number of heart rate? What is the heart rate? Let us say it is 72. Then it is 60 or 70 ml into 72. Calculate it and let me know the answer. So this is the answer. 4,322 to 5,040 ml. So this is cardiac output. Now Now, here is a little interesting chart that I found. Now, this is something we know. Cardiac power output is dependent on the heart rate and stroke volume, and we already know the stroke volume is nothing but the leftover amount of blood after removing the end systolic volume from the end diastolic volume. Now, here what they're talking about is the factors that are going to affect the heart rate and the stroke volume. That means what is going to increase or decrease the stroke volume and what is going to increase or decrease the heart rate. Please remember one thing: the heart rate or the heart beats, the contraction of relaxation, it is automaticity. This heart beating is not under the control of the nervous system. The cardiac muscles themselves generate the impulse to allow the contraction and relaxation of the heart muscles to create the heartbeat. But as we've already discussed, the rate, that means, what do you mean by rate? It is the number of beats. The number of beats per minute, they can be affected by hormones like adrenaline, like we spoke about. They can be affected by the fitness levels. They can be even affected by the age and autonomic invention, that is neural control. Sometimes when there is too much pressure or stress, then also you will have the neural control which will kick in. So these will affect the heart rate. Similarly, stroke volume will be affected by the heart size, fitness level, gender. Yes, this is, even though till now whatever numbers we have taken, it is an average healthy adult person, but again the numbers will slightly vary when it comes to male and female. Contractility, okay, duration of the contraction, and afterload, that is resistance. As we have said, there will be resistance in the blood. So all of this will control the stroke volume. All right, so now we are going to go to the last two topics in this section, that is blood pressure and pulse rate. Now, blood pressure is defined as the pressure with which the blood flows into the arteries. Okay, it is the pressure of the blood in the arteries, of blood in arteries. Okay, so from the ventricle, so how will be the movement here? The movement will be like this: from the ventricles, left ventricle more specifically, to the aorta, and from the aorta to the arteries. Whatever pressure of the blood will be there here, this is called as the blood pressure. Okay, now when the pressure that is happening here, this pressure where the ventricle is pushing the blood out, ventricle is pushing the blood into the aorta, this is happening due to when ventricular systole. So the pressure here is ventricular systolic pressure or systolic pressure. So blood pressure is counted as systolic pressure when you're saying the systolic pressure of the blood pressure or systole, you're talking about the ventricular pressure which is pushing the blood from the ventricles into the aorta. Right. Then a little bit of the same amount of pressure with a little difference will be carried into the arteries. Similarly, when there is relaxation of the ventricle, when there is ventricular diastole, as we have discussed, the pressure comes down. So that pressure will be called as the diastolic pressure. Diastolic pressure. Okay, now the normal blood pressure in normal, very normal, healthy adult average individual, the normal blood pressure is 120 by 80. 120 by 80 is the normal blood pressure, where 120 is the systolic pressure and 80 is the diastolic. And if you go back and see the cardiac cycle, we said that when the ventricles reach a pressure of 120, then only there is pushing of blood, and at 80 the blood will not push. So this is 120 by 80 is systolic diastolic pressure. Now I'm coming to the last part, that is pulse. Now pulse is said to be, let me remove this. So we are going to talk about pulse. Now one pulse per minute is equal to 1 heartbeat per minute. 1 heartbeat per minute. So it is nothing but it is the expansion and recoiling of the arteries. Now pulse is due to the expansion and recoiling of the arteries. Recoiling of the arteries when there is ventricular ejection. When the blood is pushed into the arteries, then there will be expansion, and then when the ventricle is relaxing, then there will be recoiling. So this creates a pulse. So each time a cardiac cycle happens, there will be arterial expansion and recoiling, right? So that's why we can say pulse is equal to the heartbeat, right? So this is your cardiac output, pulse and blood pressure, right? Now next we will go to the concepts of the arteries, the vessels, the various blood vessels that carries the blood, and we're going to understand another concept called as double circulation in the following videos.
For more content, like, share and subscribe to www.i-win.in.